by Anna Marie Didio. Welcome to the show, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Can you tell people a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure, I'm an adoptive mom turned children's book author, and I focus on adoption, trauma, grief, and loss. And my mission is to promote honest conversation and between children and families, and an open discussion about adoption and how it is working in their family.
Okay, that's quite interesting, actually. I've not had any experience with adoption myself, not through friends, family, or anything. So, can you tell me how that process came about, first of all?
Well, when we well, years ago, of course, I had many infertility issues and we were unable to have a child. And we looked into adoption and decided on an open adoption, which is a process by which you maintain contact with the birth mother. And so we went quite a ways down the road and had pretty much stopped infertility treatments when I got pregnant. So we did have a beautiful baby girl, but then adding to our family proved impossible. We wanted a larger family. We wanted a sibling for our daughter. And we went down the adoption route again. And I had a number of failed attempts. One agency closed, another agency we were never selected. And so I happened to see an article in the newspaper about a summer camp for children who lived in shelters and orphanages in Mexico. And at the bottom of the article, it said in tiny print, "These children are available for adoption." So I began to look into it, and that's how a little bit uh, unique path. But we traveled to Mexico and met a daughter, our daughter to be, because our other daughter by that point was 7, 8 years old. A lot of time had passed, so that's really how the short story of how it all happened.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Like I said, I've never met anybody who's adopted before, and I think it's there's a lot of children out there who need families, right? And it's it's not as many people from what I'm aware of that actually stepping up to take care of and offer good homes to children. And I think that's something we should promote more, really.
Well, I'm a believer in it, obviously, an advocate. I support it. There's a lot of questions now around, well, of course, many countries have stopped their international adoptions for one reason or another. International adoptions in the US have decreased over the years, and the most frequent type of adoption is family or foster care to adopt adoptions. But you're right, I think it's a good process. It is very challenging. I think family connections should be sought first, and there are a number of things now that have created a buzz within the adoption world that families should proceed carefully and not just forge ahead.
Yeah, I suppose there's a balance there, isn't it? And you've got to get it right. And there's, it's somebody's life at the end of the day, isn't it? So you've got to make
Yes.
sure that it's the right thing for them as well. How did you find integrating kind of a second adopted child into an adopted family? Is that difficult or?
It actually was tremendously difficult, just because, and I'll start with the premise of my books, and that is all adoptions begin with trauma. So if you think about it, the trauma begins actually the first step when the infant is separated from the biological mother. So that's really an event that sometimes doesn't manifest in the family until much later, but it is a traumatic event. And interesting, for our daughter, that happened twice over because she had lived 6, almost 7 years in Mexico. And she, one day went to sleep in Mexico, and the next day she was in suburban Philadelphia in a whole new family in a house. And she was, at the time, and again, this is what I write about, at the time, I really didn't appreciate all that she had lost and it was very very traumatic, and she cried for months actually.
Yeah, it's not only is it a change of losing out on kind of a parental figure, but it's a culture change as well, right? Because it's a
Yes,
completely different culture moving
everything
from Mexico to to
to the US.
Philadelphia.
And
Yeah.
when you think about it, sights and smells and food and the caregivers and the routine. One time, when she assimilated into speaking English rather quickly, but at one time when we were still having some things translated, of course, we did not speak Spanish. Um, and I asked the translator what she said, and she said she was bored in our house. She was bored because when you think about it, she had been in this wonderful loving environment with 30 or 40 other kids, and they were constantly playing and having fun together, and they went to school together. And then suddenly she was had this older kind of sour faced sister that wasn't that wasn't exactly thrilled that she had joined the family either. So it was an interesting mix that we had to adapt to for many years.
Yeah, I can imagine how difficult. I mean, I have a family myself, and it's difficult just day to day normally anyway. Let alone coming over kind of language hurdles, trying to integrate with
Right.
with your other child, and it's just must be so. I can't imagine how difficult it must be.
Well, we hired a tutor, and we kind of made a game out of it, trying to teach our older daughter some Spanish and, of course, the younger daughter English. And so we tried to help whenever we could. But one of the things we did very deliberately was embrace her culture. So we kept in touch with the women at the shelter, and they're in touch to this day actually. And that was 20 years ago. So it was, I think, important for her to have those connections. If we could, nothing we could do to ease the big trauma, but we did what we could to ease the transition.
Yeah, it's kind of all you can do, really. What was the biggest challenge? Was that it? That just that integration in general, or was it something else?
Well, you could say that that's a good way to describe it, integration, because there were so many little things, and it was difficult for her to find that rhythm, find that, so the place felt like home. And in the beginning, as I said, she cried and was very very sad. And we did seek the help of some professionals to enhance our communication and talk about how we could be a family. And so, I mean, for those out there, families that are either considering adoption or perhaps have foster children, or stepchildren, children that are part of a blended family, there's always that, and I'll use the word trauma. There's always that trauma in getting used to new circumstances, new things. And that's why I decided to write my books.
Yeah, and actually, there's a large portion of the population in the US, especially, and the UK. I imagine I haven't got the figures on the UK, but I imagine it's very similar. But nearly 40% of families in the US are blended, so that would be step
Right.
parents, stepchildren, etc., as well included in that. But there's integration involved in that just the same, right?
Of course, yeah. There, family routines, the same things apply. Food, sights, smells, caregivers, family routines, special events. Um, in my books, actually, I write about a few triggers for adopted children or any children, getting used to a new home. And in particular, those are birthdays. I mean, birthdays are sometimes hard for adopted children, thinking about that connection to their birth mother. Um, and also, an assignment that kept coming up over and over for both girls was constructing a family tree. So she was, our daughter was living in our home not 2 or 3 months, when at school she had the project to put together a family tree, and most of the folks on the tree she had not even met. So we were challenged, just kind of getting her used to who was in the family, who they were, and that's a big that's a big ask for a kid to just absorb all those people and new places, new everything.
Yeah, that must be so difficult for them to try and figure it out. And I think probably as as the adopted parent, you might take the brunt of it as well because whoever we're closest to are the people that we kind of take out our negative emotions on, aren't they? So if we're struggling with
Right,
something, it kind of comes out to the people who are closest to us. So
right,
it
right.
can be
And
quite
that's
challenging in that way, right?
well, and that's you're exactly right. You're mentioning one of the um, behavioral aspects of trauma is that disassociation. She tried to separate from us when she could, and she latched on to teachers and babysitters, and she just was in her mind, I guess, trying to come to the come to terms with a new family, because the family, for all intents and purposes now, because she was not in her homeland anymore, she was in the US, and this was a permanent situation. So that was a lot for a kid to absorb and digest when you were happy before. Nothing was, nothing in her world said, "Oh, I gotta leave." We thought she wanted a family. The shelter said, "Oh, the kids want a family," but the reality of that separating from all that you know and love is pretty tough.
Yeah, it's just turning the world upside down, isn't it? And they don't understand. And maybe later on in life, when they're older and they're adults, and they look back and they'll be like, "Oh,
Right,
yeah, actually, this was really good for me, and it gave me a better chance in life and a better life." Whereas, I mean, we're all guilty of that. Even me as a child, when I was a child, um, you didn't realize the sacrifices and the efforts that your parents put in to
oh,
kind of give you a good life and give you a good start. It's only when you become an adult you look back and you're like, oh, and you have kids yourself, and then you're thinking, oh, it really kind of opens your eyes to what they've done for you, and you become more appreciative. And but it takes time to get that point, I suppose.
yes. Yeah, the realizations, you're right, doesn't ring true. The whole, I don't know, I'll say sacrifice of parents and what they do, and that that's something you don't realize until you're a parent. So so with age and with as the years flowed, things obviously got better and better, and then the girls uh, are completely different personalities, so that didn't help either. So they had totally different interests and coping skills and everything else. So we're still working on that to this day.
Absolutely, and there's no such thing as a perfect family in any sense. No matter if they're adopted, or if they're stepchildren, or if they're born, natural born and biological children. It doesn't make any difference. It's difficult all the time. There's always kind of stuff that's, you know, um, but I got two. I've got a stepson and I've got my own daughter, and they constantly, kind of finding their way in their kind of relationship together as well as we are with them, and it's constant.
Right,
It's
right.
constant learning, constant development, and constant trying to understand each other. Really.
Well, one of the continuing struggles, of course, was that English was a second language for her. She was learning English, and of course spoke adequately after 6 months or so. But the writing and reading, proper use of grammar, sarcasm, just funny things were all still missing from the equation, and that created kind of another separation between the two sisters. So she did connect very successfully with her ESL. Well, at one point we called it ESL in the US, English as a second language. I think it's called language arts or language development now. And she connected very successfully with that person, and who helped her with pronunciation and understanding, comprehension. Um, but of course, our other daughter was so adept in reading at such an advanced level. So the two of them were constantly bickering about schoolwork. And so I get your comment about a stepchild. When you're living that closely together, every little thing is a competition.
Yeah, it very much feels that way sometimes. Are they constantly trying to outdo each other or outshine each other? But equally, I don't think it's a bad thing. And I think, especially in the context of your children, I think as they go through life and get older, they'll get so much better and they would learn so many skills at, trying to understand people who are different to them. And I think that can only help them through life.
Right, the empathy is there, and my younger daughter went on to have a very meaningful position. As I said, we live in Philadelphia, and she works in the nonprofit community with the Hispanic population. So one thing that was really positive as she grew, her desire to reclaim her language. So it began in middle school, and when she began to hear instruction and some of the accents and many of the vocabulary really came back to her. And then as the years passed in high school and then in college, she became totally fluent again in Spanish. And I think that that really helped her, identity and confidence. And she, I think in her head she was able to reconcile a lot of things from her past. So that was a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's important, holding on to your kind of cultural roots and your heritage and stuff like that, because it's part of who you are, right? And I'm sure she's probably had a battle going through her life, especially early on, thinking that she's trying to like kind of push that to one side, if you will, to try and get
Right.
integrated into a different way of life and a different culture, but then you don't want to lose it. I kind of have on a different scale and a different level because I'm living in England, but I'm actually Welsh. So we have our own language, and I went through school and spoke Welsh and did everything in Welsh in a different language. So I kind of completely agree with that. I've had to kind of push it to the side to go and kind of get on with stuff. When I moved to England and I was doing everything and I was working and everything else, but I still haven't let go of that heritage, and I
Oh, yeah.
refuse to.
Did you learn, but a as a Welsh as someone who's Welsh, did you learn both of those language simultaneously when you
Yeah,
were
so Welsh and English together. So I was bilingual. I wasn't really one, but Welsh is kind of obviously my cultural heritage and how I was brought up and raised through school and everything else, and all the traditions around the Welsh kind of stuff, which are not prevalent in England. You don't get that in England. So I kind of understand on a smaller scale, of course, but I understand, and I do think it's important to hold on to that heritage.
everything. She was, um, very curious about cooking different Mexican dishes, and we tried. And on my website, I have a few recipes of things that we did together. Mexican lasagna and her favorite cookies and things. And so that was really part of what we tried to do to establish, new connections or new traditions or new things that we could do together that were not so threatening. I mean, homework was always the drama associated with homework. But if we were cooking together or preparing to, I don't know, go for a walk or something that was an activity, that really helped with just with the whole process. So, but we did rely, as I said, on professionals at various stages in her development because the issues and problems that she was processing and thinking early on in her life were so different as she grew like into a teenager. So I remember in the beginning we had a therapist that was really adept, really specialized in play therapy, and I had never really even heard of it. And her office was amazing with all kinds of toys and things and little miniature caricatures. We played in a sandbox, and it just helped us together do some things. So I always recommend that for folks that are just. It was kind of a neutral space for us to maybe bond as a family. So we tried that.
Yeah, that's good. I like that, and I think it's important that that neutral space can really help as well, right? It stops people feeling like they're on the back foot immediately.
And it provides a space where I think parents often take on this, I have to have all the answers. I have to be able to solve all the problems. And I really wanted to provide a space for her to speak to someone else, even though she said she didn't want to. We went we went to therapy a couple times. And I said, well, just, talk to this person, that person, because on the chance that a relationship would click and develop, I wanted to provide that opportunity for her to speak to someone that wasn't me, that wasn't her parents, and maybe run some things by that person, and just do the things, talk about the things that teenagers think about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think that's specific to adoption. I think we're all guilty of kind of that kind of being in that way, aren't we? And trying to, I suppose, as parents, sometimes we feel like we know better, and maybe we do to a degree, but that doesn't help the child. We got to kind of bring ourselves to their level to try and, because they want to feel understood ultimately, don't they? They want to feel
Right.
understood and heard, and we can be bad for doing that sometimes.
Right. And then they grow up, and then they just tell you that you know nothing. So you're just it's so anyway, it's a process for sure.
Absolutely is. But if somebody was planning on, going for adoption, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, a couple of things. One thing that really helped us was the agency was instrumental in helping us connect with other families that had adopted, some from Mexico. Well, specifically from Mexico, that was really interesting, just to see how other families had, because they had adopted children, actually all ages. So it was interesting to see how those families had evolved from when the child was first adopted, what they were doing now, and the language issues. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend. Use the professionals, and connecting to people so much more it's easier, so much easier today than it was when I was doing it. I literally had a phone book, and I was calling every entry under A for adoption. But now there are so many groups online, adoption coaches, uh, folks that can help all along the process. So anyway, that's one. And two is research. I mean, read. There are so many great books today in terms of families learning about the trauma, and being prepared for it. And again, but that's the reason I wrote my books. Is a very unique aspect of my books is to encourage discussion around those difficult topics. So the child is going to feel some sort of trauma, and it may be slight, it may be severe, but encouraging and acknowledging that discussion, I think, helps blended families really thrive and grow together.
Yeah, it does for sure. And I think it's important that, like, the internet and, the ability to video chat and all this other stuff now that we have makes things so much easier for people to connect, because I think it's only like 2% of the population in the US, or population of children anyway, are adopted. So, you're not necessarily going to connect in the same community. So we need to reach out and use these tools to
Right.
connect and to find people that can help us, right?
Right, and you're right. The virtual groups and things that are even training sessions. I've seen so many webinars, Zoom sessions about topics that are very difficult, and it's almost as if, well, first of all, the ease of attending these events is just tremendous. You can just, so many of these events are recorded, and you can dial into them. Um, but to take part, you can even take part, live, and not even have your camera on, and just listen to everything. So it's really a no lose situation. It's just win-win all the way around for parents to become informed as to what possible hurdles, may exist for a child. To become aware of that child's history is super important, especially in foster situations. Foster care is just a very difficult um, It's families that are, willing to step in for a short time sometimes, or a long time, but it's important to be prepared for, and there's always training involved in those kind of situations. So there's a lot people can do to get ready.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a big challenge taking on, taking on children who have, e- even before the adoption or being fostered, that there's usually some trauma there that's led to getting to that point, right? Like you've said previously. Um, and we have to support the children with that. We have to support them through that trauma. So it helps if we understand or if we get support ourselves to enable us to be in the best position to do that.
And the social workers are usually aware of the triggers, that kind of thing. Remember reading, I was listening to a podcast recently, and the foster parents were saying how the child didn't want to be in the bathtub. Like that was some sort of trigger for her. So they were aware of that, and they never even suggested it. And she was able to, I don't know, use the shower, and you never know what specific thing. And so that's why one thing I would just encourage parents, potential parents, to just be aware of, what this child has gone through, and how best to successfully kind of integrate them into your family and your routines and your expectations.
Do you think that has anything to do with why international adoptions have gone down? Because maybe you don't get the same level of history or the same contact to be able to
Mhm.
understand that.
I think there's a couple reasons, but first and foremost, some of the adoptions were um, uh, shut down in, I'll say, and I know very little about this, but Ethiopia, Guatemala, and those countries in particular, the adoptions were not, um, were not being um, facilitated in an honest way. There was a lot of um, maybe black market, or there was a lot of um, children being represented as orphans when they were not. And so those kinds of practices were just stopped. And then the Ukraine and Russia, of course, had been very active in the adoption world, and that stopped due to the political situation. I know China has just recently called a halt to adoptions. So it's multifaceted for different countries and different regions, but um, so there's really not just one, but it's and then laws are constantly changing. It's very difficult. The laws around uh, Mexico, for instance, now are completely different from when we adopted, and require, I think, a certain number of weeks residency before you would leave with the child. So it's complicated.
Yeah, and I get that the laws are there for, they're brought in with the best intentions and the best interests of people, aren't they? But sometimes it can kind of make the process more difficult and
Right.
put it out of reach of some that may be good potential parents, really.
But the adoptions in the U.S. are increasing are family adoptions. So that's really been, well, they've been the emphasis of a lot of adoptee groups, is to try and maintain that family connection if at all possible. I'm totally supportive of that, but if that's not possible, I know of many children that have been adopted, successfully, and it's worked out well.
Yeah, I've got some stats that I did a little bit of digging before the show, and I came up with some stats on here. So of all the children that are adopted in the US each year, so 59% are from foster care, 26% are from other countries, and 15% are through domestic
Mm,
private agencies.
mhm.
So it's quite the majority there, 60% pretty much of people who are in foster care were then adopted, which is a good thing really, because they've provided them home for so long to give them some stability, and then they've adopted them, taken them on potentially as which
right.
which
Agreed.
is a positive, right? They've built that relationship. They've got some stability in their life, and as long as everything's going well, then that's really good. And then the other stat I've got here is the so from the peak in 2004 was the peak of international adoptions in the US, and that's declined 82% since then.
Right. Yeah, it's been so ours was 2003, so we were right in that, in that window, and yeah, now it's just changed significantly. So,
Yeah, and it's difficult to say if it's good or bad, and I think this probably an argument both ways, but it's as long as they're done correctly and done in the best interest of the child and the families, then I think that there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's just getting that balance right, isn't it? And it's more difficult, I suppose, when there's conflicting states and laws and
yes.
stuff like that to get that balance right.
Yeah, you've hit on like the wild card, in adoption, because in the US there are very few states that have unrestricted access to records for adoptees. And that's something that's changing, but overall, I mean, I think adoptees should have access to anything in their history. So some adoptees still to this day have never seen their birth certificate or know what they should know about their medical history and or family history. And I don't agree with that. So gradually states are moving in that direction, and the regulations or access to records have been opening up. But it's a crazy quilt of states, or state laws are always very varying, and each state is working to change that. But we'll see. It's kind of a and it's an additional hurdle for adoptees that's really unnecessary, and again just adds to this whole issue of trauma that I've been focusing on and talking about. Why are those circumstances so different? These children should have access to these records.
Yeah, I think transparency is really important, right? Because if it feel like things have been hidden or things are a little bit sneaky, then that immediately puts you in a position where, as the child, you might think, well, something's wrong here, something's not right because they're not telling me everything. Things have been
Right.
hidden from me, so you immediately think that there's bad intention there.
And it goes to the question of identity that I had raised earlier, that adoptee identity is so kind of tenuous as it is. They're in a new family, they've been separated from their birth mother, and so the best practice and the advice from professionals is that parents should be communicating everything about the adoption to the child even before the concept of adoption is really understood. So, I mean, gradually that light will dawn, but um, so the children always know what their story sounds like, and so that same we all know the story of our birth and our how our parents got together and how, but all that is uncharted for an adoptee. But those stories should be told to children as soon as they're able to as soon as they're able to hear, and then that way, as you said, there are no secrets, and it just helps with their own identity and their own place, finding their own place in the world.
Absolutely. Sorry, my dog is going nuts. I think somebody just walked past the house, so he's just having a moment. It's just what he does. He doesn't like anybody coming anywhere near the house. So, yeah, it's crucially important, and I think it's it's a journey of kind of self discovery for the child as well as the family. So I think it's important that you kind of uh, get all that information out there, and you all kind of learn and grow together. Really.
And kids talk, so they need to have something to say too. If they're in a group of kids and they're all talking, all the girls are talking, the guys are talking in their at their sports activities or in the hallway at school, or the adoptee should have the same information as all the other kids and just know all the details. And I'm a big advocate for more information. So in one of my books, the book is called How I Wonder Where You Are. And as we pointed out, there are fewer international adoptees, but one of the things that is very common for adopted children wondering, even if they know their story or know adopted as an older child, where did I come from though? Who do I look like? And being out in the world and seeing women that look like you, could this person be my mother? Even though you know that that's not really the case, it's natural to think that. So I raised this issue, in one of my books, that it's very natural, and I'm hoping that parents can discuss this with kids and give them permission to wonder and think about their birth mother, and of course maintain contact if that person is known to them.
Yeah, and it's important that they, because we can help them explore their feelings, right, and their emotions. And if we make it a secret, it becomes something dark, or that they should be people should be ashamed of, and things like that. That's how people perceive it a lot of the time. Whereas if we're open and transparent about it, and we help them explore how they feel, negative and positive emotions around it, then that can only benefit them and the family unit, really.
Yes, and that's really the goal, because as you pointed out, with these blended families, who else is in the family? I mean, there may be other children. I know there are, in some large families, there's a mixture of, for foster to adopt, there still may be some foster children, some adopted children, some biological children. So everyone should know their backstory, and and how they came to fit in that particular family. It's super important.
Absolutely, and it's only by knowing it that they can, can own that is part of who
Mhm.
they are, part of their history, and kind of grow from it, and be, who they want to be. When they not sure, they might feel a bit left out or a bit isolated from everybody else, and struggle to make any kind of connection.
And I think in those types of blended families, it's important for all the children to know, as you just said, because all those circumstances are different.
Yeah, no two will be the same, right? No two will have the same history,
Right.
and I suppose that's very similar for a lot of children anyway. Even in any blended family, they'll have different kind of things that they remember from when they were younger, etc. So
Right.
it is important that we accept and acknowledge, especially like I say, what was it, 40%? I think of families in the US are blended families, so it's a large portion of the population. So we need to get better at knowing how to deal with that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And I guess that's kind of partly why you wrote your books, right? To kind of help people with that.
Yes. So the books, and the most recent book, actually, I've changed a little bit. The first three picture books that I've written are for children age 4 to 8 ish, 4 to 10, where some of these difficult topics are raised. And I've really tried to work a balance of what parents, need to know and what children need to know, and hopefully promote that discussion. So the most recent book that I've just launched is a middle grade chapter book. So this is for children aged 8 to 12, and the story centers around Grace. The book's title is called Grace's Right Time, but Write is Write. She likes to write. She writes in her journal. She's very smart. She likes to read, but she has trouble making friends. So her parents have just moved to a new city, and she makes a new friend, Andy, who is adopted, and he enlists her help to seek out and find his birth mother. So his adoption was a secret. His adoption was quote unquote private, and but he's always been uncomfortable with that because he's never known his story. So he enlists Grace, and the two of them go on a secret mission to find his birth mother. So it was a way for me to write about the process that families go through and the realization of, some parents not really understanding how important it is for the children to have their story. And so that was the intent with that book. So I have some great reviews. All of my books are available on Amazon, of course, and more information about all the books is on my website, which is amddio.com. That didio.com. So I've kind of an explanation of the books and some other articles that I write about adoption and other podcast interviews. So everything's on the website.
That's good. That'll help people kind of, have a starting point. I suggest with a lot of this going on. Um, what are your thoughts on kind of adoption at the minute? With I see a lot. I've not done a lot of digging into it. I need to look into it a little bit more. But there's a lot of talk in the kind of the Western world now about the decline in birth rate. Do you know much about the decline in birth rate?
Just what I've read, in the news. I've not studied it specifically, but yes.
No, same. So I've listened to a little, through audiobooks, podcasts, and what I've seen, and I wonder if that's going to see an increase in international adoption again, because there's, like I say, there's or maybe the opposite. There may be a ban on it potentially because they want to try and increase the birth rate. But essentially, if the birth rate drops below 2.1, then we are not reproducing at the rate to keep population as it is, so that we'll have
Right.
decline in population, and that's the principle behind it. And the thought is that we are heading that way because it's decreasing all the time in the Western world, at least. Um, so I just wonder if you had any thoughts about it and thoughts of how that might impact adoption moving forward.
Well, there are so many facets of adoption, actually, that are a little bit at odds. I know that there are adoptee groups out there that see adoption as um, not the right solution for families because of the trauma and the disconnect from the birth mother. I don't really know what the alternatives could be if families are not prepared to care for children. Um, but it's not. I mean, every adoption is unique is really the saying that I've read over and over, and all family circumstances are unique. So there's just not one solution, or it'll be interesting to see what happens to the adoption the adoption rate, and the political situation in our world isn't getting any easier, or um, so I'm not sure that the statistics around international adoption will be changing anytime soon. I think it'll probably flatten out a little bit, and then we'll see the next few years uh, what all these changes, how all these changes impact the process.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it'll pan out or which direction it'll kind of go, to be honest. But I do see adoption as a really important because, when we have children in the world that can't be cared for, appropriately, or and a lot sometimes are removed from their mothers, via court order or
Right.
stuff like that, removed from their families, so they can't be with their families. Then we need to have an efficient and effective process to get good families for these children, to give them the best chance at life. Really, that's my belief anyway, and I hope that not only does adoption kind of continue at a decent rate, but that we get the balance right of connecting the right children with the right families. Really.
That's really the issue, and that adoptive families are screened or scrutinized or approved at such, and their backgrounds really investigated, and that the family is prepared for all of because as I said, it's not an easy process, and families do need to be prepared for that. Love and sometimes it's portrayed. It's called the myth of adoption, and the entertainment world loves to portray, children without families, and then finding a family as the answer to everything. But the families need to be educated and prepared to deal with the trauma and deal with um, the very unique circumstances that this child, presents.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, like I say, but well, I have a family myself, so it's I know how difficult it is just to have a biological family and or a a blended family, let alone you layer in all these other complexities and difficulties, and it's more difficult, than just having your own children ultimately. So and people need to be prepared for that, and they need to, and there
Right.
should be support for them. There should be as part of the process. There should be support prior, during, and after the process to ensure that they're in the best place possible to create that family unit really.
And, parents themselves are often recovering from trauma, whether they've had, as we did, years of infertility struggles, miscarriage, or, um, divorce and remarriage. I mean, that these are all very, uh, complicated and stressful and traumatic situations. And so thinking that everyone's just going to come together and be one big happy family is not realistic. And I think that's what some of um, the movement and some of the adoptees, there's concern around just more care, as you said, more care being taken in the development of these families and pulling people together than just love will solve everything and we're just all terrific. So it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I think personally they should enlist people like yourself and people who've gone through the process, who understand it, in great detail to kind of to get that information and that kind of knowledge that you've got over the years to help guide that process really,
Mhm.
which rather than trying to just people who've never adopted kind of just trying to figure it out, just use people who've been in them situations, who've been through it.
Well, now there are so many other adoption, podcasts and adoptees that have written books about their struggles that I've read. A couple of bestsellers out there, and much more about, um, including the birth family, and as I said, making that story part of that child's identity is so important. So there's just so much more awareness about that now, and I think that parents are paying attention to it, and it will result in a much better family dynamic.
Yeah, I hope so. And like I say, having that story, because if we don't help them with their story, the children to kind of create that story of how
Right.
they come to be adopted, how their life is going forward and stuff like that. If we don't help them, they'll create their own anyway. So we need to help them create a positive story rather than you know focus on the negative and increase the trauma essentially.
And as I said, the book that I think actually it's one of my favorite of the books is the book that I mentioned, How I Wonder Where You Are. And on my website that I mentioned, there's lots of read aloud apps, but there's one particular read aloud app called Snuggle Stories, and Snuggle Stories. And maybe I don't know if you have little kids or not, but they have children's books and they kind of animate them and someone reads them. There's a little music. And so on my website, one of my books, this second children's book that I've written, picture book, is read out loud with some animated effects and a little bit of music. And so if parents want to get a sneak peek as to what some of my books are like, you can go on my website and and listen to that and kind of read the book through the website.
I like that. I like that idea. It'll helps keep the kids kind of engaged as well, doesn't it? Into
Yeah,
sometimes. So I like
entertaining.
that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of time for that. So before we kind of bring this to a close, Anna, do you have any kind of final thoughts or messages for people out there, people who may be looking to adopt or people who've potentially already adopted?
Well, as I said, if adoption is in your heart and in your um, in your heart, on your mind, as a way to perhaps grow your family, I would suggest connecting with an agency that's very experienced and can put you in touch with other families. So that's really the first thing, just to have informal conversation and hear about what the process has been like for other families, perhaps in your community. That's really the most valuable thing. Of course, as you said, there's so much virtual experience that we can have now with groups and families, but to connect with families in your own community is just so valuable. And then really do your research and read about uh, the process of adoption. Perhaps if you're considering an international adoption, what are the laws and restrictions? Um, and just explore those things. And then finally, if the adoption does come to pass or you're looking for help to get ready for that event, then seek out the help of professionals. There are professionals very specifically connected to the adoption community and specialize in the process, the laws, the relationships. So different professionals have different areas of expertise, and that those folks have really benefited us as a family when we went through it. And I know that there'll be a really a comfort and a wonderful resource of information for couples or families thinking of adoption.
Yeah, it's important to get that help and support, especially if you've got no experience of it at all. Then, because
Right.
for instance, I wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't know, how to go about it even. So it's important that you do seek that support and seek that help. Are there any kind of groups out there that you'd recommend or anything, where people can kind of connect
Well,
with other families?
I think the key is to, as you're doing your research, sort on the things that are important to you. And that is because obviously the biggest decision that a family would make would be international versus domestic, the age of the child, perhaps the sex of the child. So then the research should be done with your specific family parameters kind of in mind and what your current family looks like. Perhaps you have no children, perhaps you have a blended family already. So that's really going to drive where people will go for the beginning stages of this, because it's a very multi-stage process. The applications, all told, our process took about 2 years, and it's also very expensive. There are agencies also out there that provide grants in the US. I don't really know about the situation in the UK, but in the US there are Help Us Adopt, and there's another agency that I just looked at, but there are grants available to help with expenses, because it is very expensive, which is another issue that people are upset about, and I totally get that. Why does it have to be so expensive? It needs to be about the children, not about the fees.
Yeah, well, I don't know why it is expensive. Is it? I take it it's because there's a lot of work that goes on in the background, I suppose, that needs to be kind of paid for. I imagine.
And we visited Mexico 3 times. So in addition to the legal expenses and the fees, and we took our daughter there twice. So it was a lot of travel, and that's always the case with an international adoption. As I said, some countries will require residency of weeks to months before an adoption will be approved. So it really depends on the laws.
Yeah, that brings me to a good point as well. Actually, you said you took your daughter there as well. How did you approach the the subject with your daughter that you're going to adopt another child? How did you do that?
Well, because she was an only child, she had said, uh, before, by that point, she was growing up, and she said, "Oh, I want a brother or sister." "Oh, we've got good news for you. We're we're going to adopt." And so it's so funny because initially she was so very excited. I also have written a memoir about it, and it's called Love at the Border: An Adoption Adventure. And so I for many years I kept a journal of what our experience was in traveling to Mexico and the infertility that we experienced. And but you asked a question about my older daughter. She was very excited. The trauma that ensued with the younger child coming from Mexico, there were so many years of adjustment. Um, I can say she wasn't as thrilled as the weeks went by that we had this kid screaming. Um, but ultimately, it was for the betterment of the family and for the two of them that they were able to blend together as sisters eventually. But yeah, it was initially it was a very exciting adventure, and which as I said, I loved writing about in my memoir. So if if reader or listeners are curious about that process, that Love at the Border is the name of the book.
Yeah, I bet that was quite an interesting time. But it's always if you're introducing another child to the family, however, whether adoption or however that comes about, it's it changes the dynamic, right? So it's much more difficult for people to kind of get used to. Um, it's kind of like the thing you said about movies with like kind of adopted children that, and you think, oh, it's going to be great. I think that's what children have that view when there's a sibling coming. They think, oh, it's just going to be
Right.
all fun and playing games and that,
Yeah.
and
No.
then you have a newborn, something crying all the time, and it completely changes their view on it.
Right. Yeah. So the two of them were, yeah, and as the years passed too, it was just then they both had phones at one point, when they were even in grade school, because they ended up going to different high schools. And like the bickering didn't stop. Someone would borrow clothes from the other one, and then they would post it on Facebook, and they would see that they had the other one's sweater on it. I mean, it just was hilarious. Well, not so funny at the time, but it was still hilarious now.
I think that's standard child behavior, though, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think. What can you do? Um, Anna, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yes, I loved your questions. Thanks so much for the conversation.
It's been my pleasure. And do you want to just remind people before I go of your website?
Yes, amddio.com. That's amdidio.com. And one of my books is Read Aloud. The information about the memoir and the other children's books are there, as also some other writings. But yeah, everything's on the website. So take a look, and I'd love to know what you think. Leave a review for a book, or drop me a note. Thank you so much.
Fab. Anna, thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Oh, there you go. It's uploaded straight.